Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight, Taipei Connections. Sorry. Got my sound on. Okay. My name is Robin Beckham. I'm a co-director of Taipei Dangdai. Taipei Connections is an online platform that we launched last week in an effort to try to bring together the Taipei art world with the rest of the global art world during this time when travel is restricted, and those of us who might usually be trying to run around the world and see as much art as possible are restricted to trying to talk about art on the internet. I'm really excited that we have a very special panel today, very special because we're able to kind of balance between the two most difficult time zones, being Taipei time and New York time. Hopefully we'll be able to get some visitors from both sides of the world, but special also because we're going to be having a really deep focus on the work of a single figure, the artist Ai Weiwei, from two of the scholars who know his work and life best in the world. We're doing this panel in particular because Chambers Fine Art brought a massive installation by Ai Weiwei to Taipei Dangdai in January. So we have here with us gallery director Dan, who's going to introduce that project and then bring forward the speakers. So Dan, over to you. Thanks for joining us. Just 1 second, you need to be unmuted.
I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me now? Hi, everyone. Thanks, Robin. And good to see you. I'm here in New York, but it looks like I'm at the convention center in Taipei. Because behind me, you see what we brought this past January, which is called Law of the Journey. And that is the inflatable boat with the refugee figures and the wallpaper called Odyssey. So I'll let John and Christina talk about that a little more. But we were very excited to bring that to Taipei Dangdai this January, and I think it was very well received. So let me introduce the scholars that will be speaking today. First, I'll introduce Christina first. Christina Yu Yu is the Matsutaru, I think I'm saying that right, Matsutaru Shoriki Chair of Art of Asia. Now, and that's at the MFA Boston, Museum of Fine Arts Boston. And she not only oversees Chinese art, she's a scholar in Chinese art, but she also leads a team of curators overseeing the MFA's collection of more than 100,000 works from East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and the Islamic world. She knows Ai Weiwei well and had a conversation with him, was it last fall? Or it could have been longer now. At any rate, has known Weiwei for years, and there was a book launch, and she had a conversation with Weiwei at the museum. Before joining the MFA, she was the director at the Pacific Asia Museum at USC, and the assistant curator of Chinese art at LACMA. I'll move on to John. John studied at Downing College in Cambridge, and he got his PhD from the Courtauld Institute at the University of London. He was an associate curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and then a curator at the Rodin Museum. He's a Rodin scholar. That's what his PhD was. He studied his PhD in. And since 2000, John has concentrated on contemporary Chinese art. And Robin will know, he was co-curator of Duchamp or in China at Uhlens at the UCCA in Beijing in 2013. And he's contributed essays to the catalogs of the Ai Weiwei exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and as well as the Andy Warhol Museum, Andy Warhol Ai Weiwei at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. So he wrote for both of those catalogs. And finally, going back to the book launch that I mentioned with Christina, This was a book that John was a co-author for. It's called Ai Weiwei, Beijing Photographs, and that was published by MIT Press in 2018. So we will hear a little bit about these projects, and I will turn it over to Christina and John now and see what they have to say.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Robin, for including us. And as you both mentioned, we live in an unprecedented time, and we all work from home and trying to cope with this situation we are in, and balance between work and, I guess, added duties from home. So maybe I will start a little bit just to give everyone a little bit idea of we as museum professionals and what has happened to us since the pandemic started to spread. So as you can see, I'm working from home, and MFA Boston, we closed to the public in the middle of March, and it has been almost 2 months. It's really hard to believe. And we, thanks to modern technology such as Zoom we're on right now, we are able to keep contact with our colleagues. But one thing that's very interesting is, maybe interesting is not exactly the right word, is actually a lot of the exhibitions and public programs that we have heavily invested in and planned for a long time right now cannot happen because there's no physical access to the museum. So there's a lot of planning and implementation of online projects and programs not too different from what we are doing right now. And also we know that a lot of museums in Asia have opened to the public, and there are a lot opened, and several opened in Europe as well. So in America, we also started to think of reopening our museum to the public and what that would be like. So John, maybe I guess you can tell us a little bit more of also how in the past several months, whether this pandemic has affected the way you work and doing your research.
Oh, certainly. I mean, it's difficult to believe that 3 months ago, I was in Taipei for Taipei Dangdai, and life seemed to be almost normal. People were walking about enjoying themselves, and there were obviously some people were wearing masks. Then 2 months later, we participated in the Armory Show in New York. And at that time, social distancing was still regarded as something of a joke. People were practicing their moves. Within minutes, no, sorry, not within minutes, but within days, I retreated to our house in upstate New York, and I've scarcely left it since. So I'm speaking to you now from the library of our home in New York State. Now, I know that the primary focus of this section is going to be on the exhibition we had at Taipei Dangdai, but it's interesting, I think, to give you a little bit of background, because I see Law of the Journey really as in a way, a culmination of many years of research, creation of works on the theme of refugees, globalization by Ai Weiwei. My real connection with his work, shall I say, was not actually through works from sculptures so much as through architecture. Because in 2007, Chris Mao asked Ai Weiwei to design a building for him in upstate New York, a building that we call Art Farm. Maybe see that, Dan? The purpose of this was to provide storage space for the gallery, because Chambers Fine Art had several different storage areas in New York City. Chris Mao wanted to centralize everything. So we asked Ai Weiwei if he would design the building. Now, many people who are familiar with him in his present guise as an activist and artist are not so familiar with his career as an architect. In 1999, he designed his own studio in Beijing, which still exists. And between 1999 and 2008, he designed approximately 80 buildings, including some fairly large complexes of artist studios and galleries in an area called Shaochengdi, bars and other less permanent buildings. The building in New York was designed on a sloping piece of land. The large section to the right is basically for storage. The central section consists of 2 offices, and the lowest section is a gallery space where occasionally we have exhibitions. About the same time, Chris Ma was thinking of opening a gallery in Beijing. And of course, the only architect he would consider was Ai Weiwei. Luckily, at that time, Ai Weiwei was designing a new complex in Beijing built in red brick. His previous projects had been designed in the grey brick, more typical of Beijing. And Chambers was the first gallery to move into this complex. And our address is red number 1D. Here on the screen, you'll see an exhibition held at the gallery in 2015, an Ai Weiwei exhibition with a fantastic, one of his fantastic trees. Well, yes, and there is Ai Weiwei standing proudly halfway up his tree.
John, actually, it's very interesting that Ai Weiwei designed both buildings. One is, but of course, one's in upstate New York, and one is in Beijing. Can you share with us a little bit more of the process of working with Ai Weiwei in terms of these 2 buildings?
Yes, well, of course, Ai Weiwei is not a trained architect. The studio that he built for himself in 1999 was a very simple structure, built actually in 100 days, but it has enormous presence, very simple and austere. When the time came to design Art Farm, he came up with the concept. He came up to the countryside to see the property, liked the sort of the way the land sloped, and he worked in collaboration with a young architect who was working in Basel, Switzerland, Simon Frommenwiller, who had worked for Herzog and de Meuron. So Ai Weiwei came up with the concepts that they were actually realized by the firm of HHF Architects. Now, of course, in Beijing, that was not the case because although it was necessary to have some professional architectural association, it was not done with anybody of the eminence of Herzog and de Meuron. But both buildings are extremely efficient. The Art Farm is very simple, and I think the space is superb, beautifully situated in the landscape. And in Beijing, it was really, I think, a very great pleasure for me to spend as much time there as I did.
That's wonderful. Jen, do we have other images? I think there's a great image of Art Farm inside with an installation of Ai Weiwei's earlier works. If we can go back to that image. Yes.
Yes, that photograph was taken shortly after Art Farm opened. It still looks basically the same. I think one of the most memorable features is the quilted ceiling. It looks rather like a Montclair jacket. That was left open, exposed, really as a decorative feature. And I have to say, the building is very cool in the summer, and it stays reasonably warm in the winter. So the architect's concept was, I think, was an effective one.
Great. So then,
Now,
after you worked with the Chambers of Fine Art and worked with Ai Weiwei on the buildings, you got to know Ai Weiwei better, and you started to collaborate with him and the Three Shadows on the photographs that he took when he was living in Beijing.
That's right. About 2009, he came to the realization that he had thousands of photographs that had never been developed, taken while he was living in New York between 1983 and 1993. There were roughly 10,000 negatives that were developed, and over a period of, I suppose around 2 years, they were developed, organized, arranged chronologically, and it was this point of the New York project that I really entered the scene, because I had been living in New York at the same time as Ai Weiwei in the 1980s, and I was quite familiar with the background, with what was happening on the Lower East Side, and so on. So I wrote an essay really describing how Ai Weiwei developed from somebody, such as the young man you see here, really, who was completely unknown to the general public, to an artist who was, in 1993, returned to Beijing. Not well known, shall I say, but at least having experienced a great deal of many interesting experiences. Here he is standing in front of a storefront in Williamsburg, New York. Next, please. He had no money, although he was extremely hospitable. Many artists from China used to stay in his studio. He had to take many part-time jobs. Here he was a street artist in Times Square. And I think we have several more. This shows the way the Lower East Side looked at the time he was there. It was really the drug capital of the world, extremely dangerous. But during the time he was living there, it became gentrified. Real estate developers really saw its potential. It was also the scene of many political demonstrations. Here's a photograph of a demonstration in Tompkins Square Park, for example. And there were many others. Well, this group of photographs was really, I think there are 213 in total, and Weiwei regards them as a work of art. So they've never been sold individually, but only potentially as a group. Well, a great deal was happening around 2008, because although obviously Weiwei had been interested as an onlooker in political developments, he was not really politically active at the time. However, in 2008, there was a massive earthquake in Sichuan province. 90,000 people or more were killed, and 5,000 or more school children were killed in shoddily built schools. This was profoundly disturbing to him. He started a citizens committee to find out really what had happened. Why was it that so many school children had been killed? And he established a citizens committee to find out who these children were, because for the Chinese government, they were simply a statistic. He wanted to know who they were, what their names were. It was at this time he was also involved in writing his blog, which became increasingly political and critical of the Chinese government. He, as you may know, he was involved with Herzog and de Meuron in designing the Bird's Nest Stadium for the Olympics in 2008, but he hated the way it was used by the government for PR purposes, and really formally disassociated himself from it. This led to increasing interest, shall we say, from the Chinese government, until he was actually arrested in 2011 and disappeared for 81 days. At the beginning, nobody knew where he was. He emerged, I would say, a different man. It was about shortly after this that I started spending a lot of time in New York, mostly from 2014, in Beijing, mostly from 2014 onwards. And at that time, we decided to work on a sequel to the New York book. This became Beijing Photographs, 1993 to 2003, published, as Christina said, in 2019.
Right, and I think we have some images here as well.
Yes, here is the reason where we went back to Beijing was that his father, the distinguished poet Ai Ching, was beginning his health was beginning to fail. As a dutiful son, Weiwei felt that he really had to go back. Here he is, standing proudly, shall we say defiantly, in the middle of Tiananmen Square. And there are several others. Having spent so much time in Beijing's East Village, he was regarded as something as a guru by young artists in China. And he spent a good deal of time in the area that became known as Beijing's East Village. This is one of the artist Zhang Huan's most compelling performances, called 65 kilograms. That was Zhang Huan's weight at the time, which he was suspended from the ceiling of a loft building there, while his blood dripped on a heated hot plate. And another one. This was also the period during which Ai Weiwei started using his famous gesture, which I liken to Winston Churchill's V for victory. This was about 1995 that he first began giving the finger to all kinds of famous buildings across the world. Here he is in Xinjiang province, because as a young man, he had lived with his father, the poet Ai Ching, in Xinjiang in exile for the first 15 years or so of his life. So, as he has said very frequently, as a young man, he knew exactly what it was like to be an exile. And another one. This was taken somewhat later, and it's a photograph of his studio in Shaochangdi shortly after its completion. You can see how austere it is. Quite unlike the opulent pilaster festoon buildings that were going up all over Beijing at the same time. This is another building that is of some particular interest now, because this was taken during the SARS crisis of 2003. Here he is again. His persona has changed, he's shaved his head, and he's standing in the Forbidden City, which is completely deserted.
And I think this image actually is, I guess, particularly relevant to where we are today, thinking of also for most part of the world right now, people are still stay at home. And also a lot of places used to be very crowded and popular still deserted.
That's right, that's right.
So actually, John, it's very interesting that you gave us a trajectory of Ai Weiwei's works or his career in terms of the 2 photographic books that you worked with him and published. And it's interesting to see that the first book that in which we see he's developing, shall we say, as an artist in New York, and still very junior and young in his career and learning from the society. But at the time, as some of the photos that you showed us, he started to be very aware of the social events and the political happenings that's surrounding him already. And then after he moved to China, he became a leader in a way and a mentor to a lot of young Chinese artists who are eager to looking for outlets to channel their creativity and looking for a mentorship to see how where their career can develop into. So when you are working with him in both these books, can you tell us a little bit of some of kind of the conversations that you had with him, and what are some of the considerations that Ai Weiwei took when he was selecting photos from these thousands of negatives?
Yes, it was extremely interesting because I used to go to the studio each day. The studio was really only a 5-minute walk from Chambers Fine Art. So I almost became part of his team. It was quite challenging because while in New York, he took roughly 10,000 photographs. In the next decade, the Beijing decade, he took around 40,000. And they were not organized in any way at all. So working with a young scholar, Stephanie Chong, we went through them and we dated them. And Weiwei was extremely insistent that we identified every person photographed. That was also quite challenging. We consulted when he didn't recognize them. We approached people that he thought might know who they were. When the selection process came, it was quite surprising because he didn't really choose the photographs that he thought he would. It would have been possible to choose well, the greatest hits and the most obvious. But sometimes they were very blurry, chosen for some particular reason. Sometimes they showed his works, but rarely. But they really showed his development in a very clear way. And then once the selection had been made, also the placing on the page was very, very important. How the photographs relate to each other. So during this time, he was basically under a sort of a loose form of house arrest. He couldn't travel because the government had his passport. So while we were sitting there going through the photographs, all kinds of people came to see him, sometimes quite eminent. So they would be sitting around the table in his beautiful courtyard, and having tea and snacks, and it would be a great privilege, really, to become part of the Ai Weiwei environment. Now, I should say, and I think that we really should start looking at Law of the Journey fairly soon. This was the period during which his works became increasingly ambitious because the Sichuan earthquake really gave rise to some major works, such as Strait. That's the work consisting of many, many tons of iron rebar used in the faulty buildings that were straightened and then arranged in different formations depending on the space in which they were exhibited.
Right, and yes, let's move to that body of work. And one thing I would just want to add that for me it's also very interesting is that his interest, or let's say, should I say, sometimes really enthusiasm of using his camera and taking photos and recording everything. That's something I always notice every time I see him, no matter where it is. He always uses his phone in his hand and taking a lot of photos. And I think this kind of awareness of documenting what is surrounding him, and also, looking, paying special attention and being sensitive to his surrounding, I think speaks a lot to his development, to his artworks today as well. And probably some of the artworks that he created in the series that we're going to look into also are, I guess, based on some of the photos that he took at different places that he visited.
That is true indeed.
Can we go to other images?
As I mentioned, he couldn't travel for over 4 years, but no sooner had the government returned his passport to him than he decided to leave the country, and he went to Berlin, where he became much more aware than he was of the refugee situation. Yes, sorry, going back a moment, there is straight in the beautiful galleries of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, overwhelming in scale. And let us stop here for a moment. In Berlin, Ai Weiwei found a fantastic studio. It was a former beer brewery underground. It's underground, a building in which the artist Olafur Eliasson lives. But the studio in Berlin is like a vast underground cathedral with almost no windows, superb spaces, and his team essentially moved from Beijing to be with him there. But he didn't stay in Berlin because he was aware of the disaster that was occurring across Europe caused by the refugee crisis. Late in 2015, he went to the island of Lesbos, just off the Turkish coast, which became a major destination for refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, who were trying to reach other countries in Europe, and started taking thousands of photographs of the dire situation in which they were living. Many of these photographs were later used in works that we'll get to later on. And also, it was during this time that he began working on a documentary, the film Human Flow, which I think you've seen, Christina. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So, so these are some of the images you see. So, as John said, Ai Weiwei went to Turkey, and he had his first life experience encounter with some of the refugees, and he was very shocked by what he saw, and that led him into looking into the bigger global refugee crisis. And I think for a lot of us who watch news a lot, before the pandemic took over almost of the news channels for a while, the global refugee crisis was occupying the headlines, a lot of international news channels. So actually, Ai Weiwei and his team, they traveled to around 30 countries or so, and sometimes he even brought his very young son with him. And it really being there to experience what these refugees were experiencing. But also the film brought a lot of human aspects into the refugee crisis. I think on the one hand, you really see the dire situation they live in, but there are also many scenes and shots where you see especially the young children trying to enjoy their life and then making a life in this very, very difficult situation. So here are some of the images we can see coming. This is an air view of, actually you can see people are, actually some people are aware of the drone and then looking up at the sky. Yeah, so. And this is an image, I think later on when we show the big installation that he did at Taipei Dangdai, probably would bring some resonance.
Oh, thank you, Christina. No, well, I think you can see that Weiwei's sort of interest in this crisis, actually, interest is the wrong word. I think I would say his passionate involvement, not only to document it, but if possible, to do something about it by creating awareness, has led to the creation of some extremely sort of telling works, many of which have a strong political edge. And it was a number of these that we took to Taipei Dangdai. So perhaps we might have a look at those now. Yes, well, this is the large Law of the Journey prototype that Christina mentioned. That was one of the focal points of Taipei Dangdai. It is overwhelming in scale. It doesn't look so very large in this photograph because this was taken in the studio that Ai Weiwei used to have on the outskirts of Beijing. I say used to have because it was maliciously demolished by the Chinese government in the recent past. In Taipei, it was installed in a much smaller space, as you can see there. And on the wall is another work by Ai Weiwei called Odyssey. When I say work, this might be a rather strange choice of word, but actually he considers his wallpaper as a form of work. It is easily transported and it can be used in many different locations. In this frieze-like wallpaper, which is divided into 6 different zones, he mixes images based on his own photographs of harrowing scenes that he had seen himself and mixes them with images taken from works of ancient art, also documenting massacres, slaughters, migrations, and so on. So there are images that come from some Assyrian reliefs, Egyptian reliefs, Greek vases, and so on. But this wallpaper establishes the context, actually the historical context in which these devastating journeys take place. I think 17,000 or more refugees died crossing the Mediterranean between in 2014 and 17, or a figure very close to that. And Weiwei emphasizes the, I think, the horror of the situation by making this sculpture, which is inflatable in PVC. That is the material used in the vessels that most of the refugees use, trying to escape from, say, Libya to Italy, and very often being rejected once they arrived. The scale is overwhelming. Here's another view of it. This is a sculpture in marble called Tyre. When he first arrived in Lesbos, he saw tires such as this, rubber tires used as lifebuoys by refugees desperate to reach their destination, washed up on the beaches. Using very fine marble, he created a sculpture consisting of 4 tires piled on top of each other, making a very grand memorial from something very fragile and tragic. Another view of it.
I'm always interested in Ai Weiwei's choice of material, and as John, as you mentioned, he uses some very mundane objects such as the PVC, and he also used the bamboos, but he also used some material that we think are considered traditionally more associated with high art, such as the marble that we saw. So I think for me, it's always interesting to see how he chooses a material and for which body of work and what that material means to him and what kind of extra meaning that material could bring to him. I know also such as, for example, wood is something that he worked with a lot, and recently he also worked with ceramics a lot, and he used ceramics and fired some of them in the more traditional classical Chinese object shapes, such as vases and plates, but the images that are on these objects are related to the global refugee crisis. So I think it'd be interesting. I think, John, you also wrote before a little bit about his usage of material. Maybe you could share with us some of your views.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up, Christina, because clearly Ai Weiwei is not only a man of ideas who is happy sending Twitters. I have to say his Twitters are much more meaningful than those of another celebrity whose name I'm not going to mention on this program, because they are all Weiwei's are very meaningful. Yes, his interest in material is, I think, comparable to that of his concern for the underprivileged and sort of those desperately seeking to better their lives. You mentioned porcelain. He has spent a great deal of time in Jingdezhen, the imperial porcelain factory, since the 15th century, and has used it sometimes in very surprising ways. Here, for example, is a beautiful vase. The imagery is not that traditionally found on Chinese porcelain of the Ming Dynasty, but based on his observation of the global refugee crisis. There is a very meaningful contrast between the refinement of the material and the execution and the devastating imagery. Yes, we just passed over the white marble hands without bodies. Could we go back to that? Yes, hands without bodies. This is quite unusual in his work, and that it actually shows part of a human body, 2 hands shaking. This is a gesture that, of course, now has is strictly verboten. But he chose it, I think, not simply as not to capture the common handshake, but also the handshake as a token of perhaps a business agreement between two titans of industry, perhaps between two politicians. So it's a rather deceptively naturalistic presentation of a series of ideas. This is called Forever, Duo Silver Bicycles. Forever title refers to the kind of bicycle that was the most prestigious in China when Weiwei was a young boy. He actually deprives the bicycle of handlebar, saddles, and bells and everything else you need on the bicycle, and makes of it a beautiful abstract form. These, in a way, hark back to his time in New York, because while he was in New York, he became very interested in Marcel Duchamp, one of whose most famous ready-mades was a bicycle wheel turned upside down on a stool. But Weiwei presents it in a much more fanciful manner, sometimes simply a pair, as in the duo here, but sometimes many thousands of them assembled in great installations designed according to the space in which they are to be installed.
So are you, well, thank you for showing us these, his recent works, and are you in contact with him recently while everyone is working from home?
Oh yes, well, as often as possible. I think that it's now fairly sort of well known that he is not living in Berlin at the moment, but is living in Cambridge, England. A very different kind of environment, and not one that one necessarily would have expected him to choose, but for a number of reasons, I think not least the education of his son, Cambridge seemed to be a good choice. And I think one can't forget too that Cambridge has a long history of nurturing nonconformists in religion in the 16th and 17th century, of producing world famous scientists such as Isaac Newton, more recently physicists such as Stephen Hawking. So I think he's chosen to live in a world in which he feels very much at home. So yes, we do speak, and we try to keep in touch.
That's wonderful to hear. I think maybe we want to see if there are questions from the participants, or if you have.
Yes, let's do that.
While we're waiting, I want to add that, of course, for Ai Weiwei's Global Crisis series, I started to follow it when he first started to make these artworks. And recently, I've been thinking of it a lot, and I think it's really cannot be more relevant to the time we live in today. I think for a lot of times, even when I first started to look at some of the works that he made, and also the Human Flow, the film that he made, there was a little bit feeling that, that is something that was happening somewhere else. And I think many points. Ai Weiwei also made a point that the reason that he wants to look into this kind of this human experiences because he wants to make people be aware that we are all connected. We live in a world that is not about them and us. Everything is relevant, and he wants to bring this experience and this crisis into people's awareness. And I have to say, recently, when I look at these bodies of works again and look at the film again, I cannot agree more that something we also felt that it was something so far away, probably that's happening to other people, not to us, but it's really happening to us now. And I'm thinking, I think, John, that I am actually from Wuhan. So when the COVID-19 started to develop, and I have been very closely following the development there in China and now here in the US, of course, because at the time when it was only in China, or mostly in China, my parents are living there. So for me, that's something, even though I didn't experience it myself, but I was very concerned because they are my closest family members. But it's still, there was a little bit of feeling that it was happening at the other end of the world. But now it's really have this deep impact on each of us, on our daily life.
Yes, because this body of work really deals with barriers between nations, barriers between the underprivileged of the world and rich capitalists in the West. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there are hundreds of millions of barriers. We each have our own barrier now, and many of these barriers are likely to persist. And so people who were already underprivileged now are going to be sort of even more victimized, I would say.
Right.
And perhaps there will be people who are elderly and infirm. There's another kind of sort of barrier. Choices being made for medical attention. So the situation, I think, really has really darkened considerably since Law of the Journey was exhibited in Taipei.
Christina, so true. And thank you so much for the conversation. We have one question here from the audience, which was if you could talk a little bit about his use of Legos as art materials.
Yes. 7 years ago, approximately, Ai Weiwei decided that it would be a good idea to use Legos, as Lego is a universally available, what should we call it, a device or what do you call Lego?
It's a toy.
A toy, yes, that can be used in many different formats. Also, it's readily available. Everybody knows what Lego is, except perhaps me, since I don't have any children. But a few years ago, he was asked to design an installation for the Alcatraz prison just outside San Francisco. And he produced a series of portraits of political prisoners from across the world, used in this executed in this extremely democratic material. And since then, it's been used not only for those portraits, but a more recent series of zodiac heads. Yes, that's a photograph of the Alcatraz installation. But right. The use of Lego is in total contrast to his preference for the use of fine woods in his wooden sculptures and porcelain in his porcelain sculptures. So it was something very democratic, contrasting with his liking for extremely refined materials and workmanship.
I don't see any other questions coming in here, but I was wondering, I had one question, which was to what was shown in Taipei Dangdai in January, which was Law of the Journey, as well as some smaller sculptures from the Marble series. And I was wondering if there's a kind of way to conceptualize, the breadth of this practice. There's so many different directions that have kind of gone on now for decades. And I wonder how we can sort of look at those things together and understand them as part of a whole. Then I have two more questions here from other viewers, if you don't want to start with that one.
All right, that's a challenging one, Robin. Let's leave that for the end.
All right. Could you talk about the idea behind the DIY sculpture that he collaborated with Hornbach?
It is the very recent sort of like the vest that he designed, right? That people is also based on the life raft that people would wear, the refugees would wear, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
I think it's slightly related. I would say not related, but actually what earlier on John talked about this using the material of Lego and using this very democratic material. And I'm sure there are many different angles we can talk about this DIY collaboration. But when I first, I confess that I haven't seen a real one myself. But when I first read it in the news, I think what struck me at the time was really this idea of making art available and and making everything accessible. And I think that is one strand that we could always see in Ai Weiwei's creation.
Yes, and the life jacket has been used in many major installations, beginning in 2009 with Remembrance. That was in which he used thousands of life jackets on the facade of the Haus der Kunst in Munich in memory of the children who had died. Yes.
Great, thank you. And now we have one more question here, which is directed to you, John. This is, John, with your extraordinary experience in the art world, how do you contextualize the present moment? And how do you see things on the other side of coronavirus from a market perspective? How do you feel that the present context will inform cultural production presently and in the years ahead?
Well, certainly I have been in the art world for my entire working life, whether as a scholar or as an auction house specialist, and then more recently with contemporary Chinese art. Clearly, I think everybody, whatever their role in the art world, is going to rethink the way they operate. And it's really, I think it's almost too soon to speculate what this might be. Zoom, for example, is a way in which I would never have expected that I could talk to people in many different areas at the same time until this morning, where it's not something I ever used. But I'm sure there are many innovative ways in which dealers, artists will overcome the extraordinary challenges we're all facing.
Great, thank you very much. That wraps up the Q&A that I am seeing here. That's also, oh, sorry, one more. They're coming in fast and furious now. Thanks all for the really interesting conversation. John and Christina talked about Ai Weiwei's earlier photos and later sculpture, and I was just wondering if the social media photos also form in art projects.
I think that's a, well, on the conceptual level, I think there's always a debate of, do you consider something an art project from the artist's perspective or from the audience perspective? But putting that aside, I see Ai Weiwei particularly using his social media less as a art creation or as a medium of art creation, but more as a way of him communicating with the general public out there, and also in a way informing us of his art creativity, his daily life, and stay connected with people.
And one more question. Have there been continued discussions around the idea of pairing Weiwei and Warhol since 2016, the exhibition?
Not to my knowledge. I think there are other ways in which this could happen, but not to my knowledge.
Great, well, thank you. Now that's really all of the questions. I think we've got them all taken care of, but it's a really great response. Thank you both so much. This has been really amazing. It's great to kind of be able to get so far into a particular artist and kind of, I think we're all very reassured to realize how deeply our colleagues and peers are still thinking about your own work and the work of artists and everyone else in the art world. So thank you very much for this. And thank you especially Dan and Chris for organizing and making it all happen. I'd just like to remind everyone as well to check out the Taipei Connections website, either through Ocula or through the Taipei Dangdai site. You can click through to the Chamber's page where you'll be able to find more information, images, and contextual information about Ai Weiwei's work, and continue this discussion from there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
And have a good night and a good morning.
Thank you to Ocula as well, and to the whole Taipei Dangdai team for putting this together. We do appreciate it. Giving us another chance to showcase what we brought to the fair in January. And I feel very privileged to have Christina and John give this conversation and dialogue today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you, Christina.
Okay, finish.